Well, part of it was, we lost our family property in Kotzebue. I'll never forget that. Um, and what I began to see was that our people did not look at land in the same way as the Western world did. We did not see it in terms of, you know, something to be bought and sold. That had not been our way of perceiving land. And then I began to see the impact of really the Statehood Act that authorized the creation of the fourth-class cities. The fourth-class city was a mechanism that essentially allowed non-native people to begin to participate in government of our communities. And right away, of course, since they understood the value of land, they needed, in their world, to have title. They invited the BLM in to do a survey. And rather than giving people the option of having a native town site versus a general town site, it went as a general town site, which meant that the title that you got was something that could be bought and sold, right? A native town site had a little bit of protection in there, a little bit like a reservation in which the federal government would have to approve of a sale. Well, this was, to me, an example of our people losing control of our environs and our space and of our land on a mini scale, but it was happening on a major scale. But most of our people never really saw that because we were propagandized to support the notion of statehood, but not told about the jeopardy that we were facing insofar as our traditional lands were concerned. And in any case, that paper turned me into an activist. I decided to run for the legislature. I figured, well, I have an issue. I was a one-issue person, right? And so, lo and behold, I won as a 20-something. I was 24 when I ran, 25 when I took office. Well, my first action actually was to come to Anchorage at the invitation of Tyonek. Tyonek was the only tribe that had money, besides Clinton and Haida. Tyonek got theirs because of a lease sale on their reservation. Anyway, there was a committee coming up, chaired by the chairman of the House Interior Committee, a guy named Wayne Aspinall, who was from Colorado. And they were looking at the public land law and looking at maybe making revisions to the public land laws. Well, they came up to look at public land, and I, smart aleck that I was, I wrote them and told them, I said, don't come here, there is no public land, this is native land, right? Well, needless to say, they did allow me to speak, and Tyonek paid for the ticket. And so I made my first public appearance down here somewhere, where I had this crude little map, and at that point there were like only about 3 land claims, right? There was Arctic Slope, us, and somebody else, I forget who. But I had them all inked out, and I basically tried to explain what I had discovered in that little paper, that we have native lands that belong to us that were in jeopardy of being taken from us by the state, and that we could not abide that, right? In any case, later on that fall, we organized the AFN in October, and we had a situation in which we had, Alaska's a big state, and in those days there's no telephones and no communications of any consequence except the mail, and so we had leaders operating in their own regions, and doing whatever they needed to do. I mean, the interior, there were selections being made along the highway, and so the Athabascans were agitated about that. the Tlingit Haida had been in court for 35 years and finally had gotten their $7 million settlement in the 60s that created the Tlingit Haida group. In any case, Emil Nadi and the Cook Inlet Native Association sent out a letter to some of the leaders, and we thought it was just going to be, a few of us kind of scattered people trying to do this and that. And all of a sudden it ballooned into what was the largest ever meeting that had ever taken place, regarding native lands. And I think we felt all pretty much united in the fact that this really was our last hope, really, of trying to preserve any of our traditional lands. And so I chaired the Land Claims Committee at the time, and we took our initial position at that meeting, and that was really what got the ball rolling in terms of the fight for the land. AFN was the vehicle, and it was a sort of a big tent. We had village representatives, we had regional nonprofit representatives, we had tribal representatives, we had individual representatives, and that was sort of the beginning of the effort to try to get a settlement. Oh, well, the biggest problem after the passage of the act was the effort by the Department of Interior to sort of rewrite the act in our view, making it very difficult insofar as the regulatory regime that they were attempting to set up. So I happened to have been selected as the president of AFN at the time, and that was our major issue, was trying to make sure that the Department of Interior had equitable and reasonable regulations to implement the land selection provisions. So we had a major battle with the Interior Department over those regulations, including the shape of the table, so to speak. I mean, really, they weren't about to sit down with a dozen regional representatives, and so of course we had to insist on that. And the other issue was, well, that was the major issue, but the other was the viability of AFN, because we went through a huge public battle over the future of AFN, because there was no provisions for an AFN in the settlement, but we had accumulated, I don't know, $800,000 in debt. And that was one of the issues I had to sort of deal with when I was president, and came up with a mechanism to get the debt paid off. We owed money to Tlingit Haida. We owed money to the Yakima tribe. I think we owed money to Tyonek. And so we had to come up, and of course there was no money set up in the act for AFN to pay off that debt, and so we came up with a mechanism to do that. And then of course the other was the land selection regulations. And then of course we had to set up the corporation. And so I became a director of NANA and eventually president of NANA. I was on the board for 20 years. And so we proceeded to try to figure out how to run a business and all the challenges that we had, because our minds weren't constructed in that fashion. So we just had to learn by doing, so to speak. And it was a real challenge for all of us. But I always figured that there was not much hope in the system, so to speak, that we would be successful. I don't believe. Because the federal government has never been interested in the success of Native people, in Native tribes. They have been in the business of trying to dissipate Native tribes and create individuals out of all of us. And when you look back at the Allotment Act of the 1880s, which was sort of designed to help the Indians appreciate private property and become these little entrepreneurs, I mean, the net result of that was really the loss of about 100 million acres of land between the 1880s and 1930s. And so in a way, I think the system was putting the burden on us really to make it work or make it not work. And so we really were going into untrod territory by providing a complex institution for our people to figure out how to run, not having had a history of, involvement in corporate activity. And so I think it's a real credit to the Native community that we took this thing and made it work. I mean, not that we're all out of the woods, because it takes constant effort, but I think it was a great challenge that our people took on, and in fact are continuing to make work successfully.